Shalom Talmidim. I'd like to just reflect for a moment or two on the Shema, particularly the verse that you memorized for this first week, verse 4, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. I'd like to just reflect on the word Echad for a moment and offer some reflections on how you translate Echad, how that affects the trajectory of the verse, and my sense of what the verse means, or part of what it means. The two most common ways of translating Echad in this verse are either as the word one, the number one, or alone. Number one, to say, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, is to make a statement either quantitative or qualitative about God's character, God's essence. God is one. And the number one in Hebrew, echad, can be used to make both qualitative and quantitative statements. It's a qualitative and a quantitative adjective in that regard. As a quantity, it identifies the number one. There's one person, one cup, one voice. Now there can be plurality within that oneness, so the crowd spoke as one voice. So there's many people, but speaking or doing some action as one. Diversity within unity. But qualitatively, it suggests a kind of unity, a fundamental, essential unity that is fundamental to God's character, as it appears in this context. Adonai Echad, the Lord is one. I would like to suggest that this is not a quantitative statement, essentially. It's partly that, of course, but at its deepest root, its deepest level of meaning, this is more of a qualitative than a quantitative statement that Moses is making here in the Shema. That God is one insofar as God is wholly unified within God's self. God has perfect integrity, or essential unity. Another way to put it, negatively, is that God is not divided. God is undivided within God's self. Now, when this oneness is something that we are intended to ritually and liturgically remember, God's oneness, God's unity, takes on a different character or meaning in that it makes a difference in our lives. God's oneness is not some high and lofty thing that we don't connect with, or has no bearing on our existence or our lives. But rather, God's oneness, God's undividedness, His unity, is directed toward us. Another way of putting it, which is how the New Testament writers reflected on it, particularly the Apostle John, is that God is love. The Apostle John looked over the sweep of God's history with Israel and saw a connection between God's oneness and God's love. Soren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, said once that purity of heart is to will one thing. And the most pure being in all existence is God. God's heart wills one thing, because God's heart is pure. Purity is another way of describing oneness or unity. Purity of heart is to will one thing, and God's heart wills one thing, and that is love. And so another way of thinking about Adonai Echad is to say that you have God's undivided attention. God is undivided in his love for you, for me, for all of us, for all the world, for all of creation. God's oneness is not, therefore, an abstract proposition or theological concept like monotheism, which plays an important role, of course, in our understanding of who God is, but was not at issue during the time of Deuteronomy. It was not at issue during the time of Moses. Monotheism is not the ultimate trajectory of the Shema. Rather, God's essential unity, God's love, and the relationship between God and God's people is ultimately what's at issue. Moses is about to die, and he wants the people to remember who God is when they enter the Promised Land. And so he tells them, this is who God is. And this is how God loves you. This is how God interacts with you. And then there's a connection between that and verse 5 and all that flows from it. And because God loves you wholly, without division, then we are to love God with all of our heart, with all of our nephesh, our self, our life, our souls, and with all of our might. So because God's love is undivided towards us, then our love can only appropriately be undivided back towards him, and then also connected to our neighbors. So this is a profound truth, because it's not something that you just memorize. God is one. Monotheism. It's not just a proposition. It's actually a living, dynamic element of our relationship with the living God. Now, if you translate it alone instead of one, there's a different kind of trajectory. This trajectory, to say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God," the Lord alone, talks about the character of our allegiance to God. That we are the people of God, and God is our God, and our only God. This connects with the commandments about idolatry, of course. That our allegiance is only given to one thing. In fact, not a thing. I apologize for that slip-up. Our allegiance is only given to one God, and that is the living God, Adonai, the God of Israel. And so, many scholars suggest that far from being a proposition, or even an ancient creed, the Shema has more to do with the renewing of our covenantal relationship. I wanted to say obligations, but that's not true, I don't think. More of a renewal of our covenant relationship, our covenant commitments or allegiance to God. That every time we say the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, we are recommitting ourselves to our covenantal companionship with the living God. So it's something that has a claim on us, and it's something that we aspire to, rather than being something that we can define or defend, as in a theological proposition. So I hope that this expands somehow, in some ways, the meaning of the opening verse for you, and I'll hopefully do this every week. Well, actually, I do a lot of it at the intensive, but I'll do another one this coming week about verse 5 in the Shema, talking about all. What do we love God with all of? What parts of ourselves?